Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Centre for Policy Studies and CapEx space for our penultimate event of this conference. We've got another one coming up on Justice of the Young at 6:30, so I hope some of you will stick around or come back for that one. But for now, we have, I think, a fantastic panel and a really energizing topic. It's something that I think has been discussed all over conference, and hopefully we can try and get to the bottom of it now before we wrap up our own programme. I'm Tom Clougherty. I'm the Research Director at the Centre for Policy Studies, and our topic today, as you can see, is can we ever cut taxes again? It may seem like a silly question, but on the other hand, we've had 13 years of Conservative government. The tax burden is at a post-war high, and all indications are that it will keep heading upwards. Probably not something that conference wants, perhaps something that is inevitable or unavoidable in the face of things to come. We shall see. I'm joined by a fantastic panel. Immediately to my left, we have Andrew Griffith, the City Minister, Economic Secretary to the Treasury, formerly. Also had a sparkling 27-year business career, including a stint as Chief Financial Officer at Sky. Speaking second, we have Andrea Leadsom. She's a member of the Treasury Select Committee and a former business secretary. We have Eamon Ives, a former colleague of mine, but currently Research Director at the Entrepreneurs Network. He was previously Special Advisor to the COP26 President. Last, certainly not least, Sam Dumitriu, who is Head of Research, or Head of Policy at Britain Remade, a pro-growth campaign group, and previously in charge of research at the Entrepreneurs Network and the Adam Smith Institute. The format is pretty straightforward, something you're all probably familiar with. We'll have a few minutes from each of our opening speakers. I'll steer the discussion for a little while afterwards, and we will leave time for questions from the floor. So, with that out of the way, Andrew, why don't you kick us off? Can we ever cut taxes again?
Well, Tom, thank you very much. And having been Finance Director for over a dozen years, I'll deliver the bad news first, if you will, which is not now, not today, because of the very unique, and this is really important to understand this debate, because a lot of people say, well, look, you've been in power for 13 years and things. We have just come off the back of an unprecedented, unforecast, unanticipated global pandemic. And so, although we can unpick some of the other bigger issues and the macro trends, it's really, really important to understand the context. And I think, by the way, the British people do never underestimate their innate common good sense that if you spend the best part of 400 billion over and above what anyone would have put in any budget forecast at any point in time to protect the economy, something that everybody went along with, and then to protect against the ravages of inflation and energy, again, that was unforeseen because of a war in European soil, the responsible thing that falls to us as Conservatives, because if nothing else, we are always responsible, is to make sure that we balance the nation's books and that we don't inflict upon people the hidden subversive tax rise of inflation, which really, really undermines, I'm trying to fix this a little bit better, that undermines the incentive to do things like save, to build capital, to be self-reliant. Really good fundamental Conservative principles that if we let inflation rip, if we didn't bear down and achieve the Prime Minister's target of halving it this year, would have some really deleterious consequences. So that's the bad news, if you like. You know, I understand we're here. I learned my political craft at the seat of the CPS and the IEA. So, you know, I bow to nobody on that. That's the bad news. The good news is that absolutely, you know, we can cut taxes again. And the way to do that is, as the Chancellor said yesterday, a more productive state, not a bigger state. I've worked in technology companies, you know, the transformation that we saw in those companies in private enterprise, in capital, over the last 20 years, you know, was absolutely fundamental. And if we're truthful, we don't see the same degree of transformation in our public services, our public sector, the sector where we spend 4 in every £10. It's quite dramatic here, isn't it?
Yes. The world is ending around us.
Yeah, I'm not sure. The breaking of the glass is the perfect soundtrack. But look, we haven't seen that transformation. We haven't seen that productivity revolution in the very large part of our economy that we refer to as our public sector. Some of that, probably most of that, should go to deliver better quality outcomes for taxpayers, for customers of those services. But certainly some of that potential productivity gain that we would see would be the sort of delta that would open up the opportunity to, at a future point in time, when we've got clear line of sight on those plans, to be able to cut taxes. That's a précis, or a slightly longer version of what the Chancellor said yesterday. He started that ball rolling by capping the public sector payroll, which, remember, today is higher than it was before COVID. And now the job of work of all of us, actually, is to unite and work together to bring forward those solutions that mean we will be in a position to do that at some point in the future.
Andrew, thank you. Andrew.
Well, thank you. And it's always surprising to me to find myself with a good colleague and somehow expected to say something different. Why on earth would I do that? So I will absolutely agree with what Andrew says. But however, I would like to take a bit of a bird's eye view and say, of course, as Conservatives, we do believe, according to our values, that there is both a moral and a practical case for tax cuts wherever we possibly can. Now, the moral case for tax cuts is quite simply because people have things they like doing and people they love, and they want to spend their hard-earned cash on the people they love and on the things they like doing. And as a feeling, empathetic, sensible, practical government, that's what we want to deliver to people. So we want people to be able to spend more of their hard-earned cash. There's also a very practical case for tax cuts, which is that, as we know, for centuries, the state has proven to be a very bad spender of our money. And I'll just give you 2 examples. One is HS2. I can talk to you as a constituency MP about the shocking waste of resources, the revolving door, the ever higher salaries, the sense that, you know, they've got 120 pages on diversity in the HS2 workplace, because obviously the taxpayer has a bottomless pit of funds that they can dip into anytime they want, and they pay themselves ever more and more and more money. So the state hasn't been a good spender of money there. And actually, at the other end of the spectrum, the state is also a terrible parent. You look at parents, families raise their children, on the whole, considerably better than the state raises a single child. So whatever the state does, it doesn't do as well as we as individuals and we as entrepreneurs and we as businesses do. So there are very strong moral and practical reasons for tax cuts. So because I am a backbencher, I can propose some of the sorts of tax cuts that I think would be attractive to the country. However, having said, and I say again, I completely agree with Andrew that now is not the time. This is not something we can do right now. However, I am aware that for many people, the most hated tax is inheritance tax. And that would be something that actually, if we were able to reduce or abolish inheritance tax, it would be one of the most popular taxes. Why? Because it actually offers the possibility of transferring from the oldest generation to the youngest generation in one fell swoop. So it would be very much transmitting wealth, capital gains, and the possibility of your own home to the youngest in our society at a cost, according to the OBR, of 7.2 billion a year to abolish altogether, a very big cost. A second one would be to increase the higher tax threshold so that you could keep more of your hard-earned cash and pay 20% on it rather than 40% on it. And at the moment, you can earn about £44,000 before you start paying a higher rate of tax. In fact, back in 1992, only 3.5% of adults paid the higher rate of tax. In 2022, it's 11%. And by 2027, if things stay the same, it will be 14% of adults will be paying the higher rate of tax. So actually, you're lifting that threshold by 10%, enabling you to keep about 54,000 of your income taxed at 20% before you pay the higher rate would cost, according to HMRC, around 3.5 billion a year. So much cheaper, much more of a bargain. Put that to my colleague here. And then the third one, which I would personally very strongly favour, and that is helping families to make their own decisions, something I absolutely love and endorse. And there, I think, one of the things we did when we came into government was to make child benefit only accessible to those on £50,000 each, or one earning more than £50,000 would lose it. So in other words, if the two of you are earning £40,999 each, you keep your child benefit. If one of you stays home to look after the children and the other earns £50,001, you don't get the child benefit. I would love to see that change. I would love to see that ability to put that power into the hands of parents to make their own decisions. Again, that's what I'm about as a Conservative. Would love to see that. So with all of those things, again, being a good Conservative, you have to say how you'll pay for it. So I'm just going to come back to good old HS2. And with huge gratitude to the Taxpayers Alliance, they've assessed that if we were to scrap the second leg, we would actually save ourselves between 64 and 75 billion quid. So we could do all of those things I mean, can we, on a show of hands, shall we vote for that? Please? Andrew, colleague, in cahoots with the Chancellor. But actually, I do, just in finishing, want to say I think the Chancellor's done a great job in talking about greater productivity, in capping the excess of the civil service, in using artificial intelligence and other technologies to try and make us much more productive, much more effective. I think the jobs and growth coming from green industries, from net zero, from life sciences, from digital, from space sector and so on, all of those offer a huge opportunity to grow the economy, thereby to pay for tax cuts. So in conclusion, absolutely yes to tax cuts, and in deference to my beloved colleague, not right now. Okay.
Thank you very much. Eamon, do you want to go next?
Thank you. I haven't even started talking. I'm already getting applauded. So yeah, can we cut taxes? As somebody who loses about half of every marginal pound he earns, I hope the answer is yes. But I suppose this is kind of one of those classic questions where we could spend the time sketching out broadly kind of an objectively right sort of situation where we want to end up. I think it's probably more interesting and more sensible to kind of think about what is politically feasible to do. And we've kind of already touched upon that, I think, a little, because I think what we have seen over the kind of the last 12 months or so is a real kind of foregrounding in the political debate of the importance of fiscal responsibility, of not putting the cart before the horse. And it's kind of incumbent upon those of us who do want to see a state which taxes people far more likely to think seriously about this. And I think kind of one of the problems that kind of sums this whole situation up is that there's been a tendency to focus a lot on things like headline tax rates and kind of getting maybe a little bit distracted by that. That's not to say that's not important, particularly if we're kind of jacking up corporation tax to very high levels, to my mind. But I think perhaps where there's a more interesting discussion to be had is around things like tax complexity and those sorts of quirks that maybe we'd want to spend a bit more time focusing on ironing out, where they distort economic activity, where they create kind of perverse incentives, perhaps where they go against other policies that the government's trying to pursue. I think that's kind of a more interesting space and something I know, Tom, you've probably done more than most in Westminster to think about. So I think I'd love to kind of get more into that in this debate. Another thing I kind of wanted to mention is that I think it's very incumbent upon us to think about how, in this sort of changing world, in this changing economy, what that means for tax policy. So things like, I mean, you mentioned sort of climate change and the green transition. That's going to have enormous consequences for our tax system. And I think it allows us to think a bit more creatively about whether we want to sort of shift the tax burden to different areas, whether that's things like carbon pricing or carbon border adjustment mechanisms. I know you've spoken about those historically, and whether that can allow us to kind of shift the tax burden from other parts of the economy and what that could mean for overall growth. But yeah, as I think it's always more interesting to get to the questions and the discussion, so perhaps if I pause there and hand over to Sam, I'll do that.
Thanks very much. Sam?
Thanks. Yeah, so I'm a bit of a lazy person, so I'm going to answer a question Tom set me on this very stage about 2 years ago on a very similar panel, but not entirely similar, which is, which taxes should we cut? Because I think fundamentally, even if we're not going to bring down the overall tax burden, there are still lots of choices on tax cuts, and we still hear a lot about different directions for tax reform. And recently we've heard a lot of debate about what that should take. So we've heard a lot about inheritance tax on this panel, but also in the sort of mood music ahead of the conference. We've heard a lot about, we heard Michael Gove talking about taxing work less rather than capital less, rewarding hard work, rewarding meritorious behaviour. And we also have sort of heard a view that's quite common, which you could call the sort of resolution foundation view, right? Which is you should focus on progressivity overall. Which tax cuts benefit the least well off the most? I take a slightly different view to sort of all three, and I think what my priority would be, and this is something that sort of I think is relevant to saying Margaret Thatcher sort of distinguished between. There's policies that are popular, and then there's policies that have popular results. And in my mind, the latter always trumps the former, because voters have quite a short-term memory for specific policies, but they have a good judgment of which direction the country is going in and whether policies in general are working. And so I think we should focus on the policies that have the biggest long-term effect on growth. There's the slogan today is long-term decisions for a brighter future, right? This is the kind of thing what you should be thinking about, real long-termism. And what does that mean in terms of how to change the tax system? First of all, I've been making the case along with Tom and along with Eamon and along with lots of different people in think tanks around Westminster for full expensing for a very long time. The key priority, I think, should be focusing on making that permanent so that you don't have a disincentive to invest in new productivity-enhancing machinery. And we've done lots of estimates. You can get quite a significant bump in growth, and in the long term, that can help pay down the effect the revenue loss from full expensing. Along with full expensing, we should be also looking at expanding the types of investments that qualify. Why is it that a investment in one machine qualifies, but an investment in, say, a wind turbine only qualifies for a slightly reduced rate of full expensing? Maybe we should expand that category and also look at expanding it to industrial buildings too. The other thing I think we should look at is marginal tax rates faced by people when you look at their income taxes and how the benefit system interacts with that. We mentioned the child benefit sort of cliff edges that you can get, but also, there's tax-free childcare, there's the personal allowance withdrawal. If you were designing a tax system from scratch, you probably wouldn't say that people with 2 children earning £99,000 a year should pay a 30 or 40% higher tax rate than people with 3 children but they're in school. It's not something you design from scratch, but we sort of, because we don't want to give all of the benefits away to higher earners, we've ended up with a system where you can be in a place where you're begging your boss not to give you a pay rise because you're going to lose almost all of it. And then I think finally we should be looking at business rates and how we can make them work better. Again, going back to the point about we need to encourage productivity enhancing investment to boost growth in the long term so that we can reduce the actual overall tax burden. We should be looking at why is it when a company invests in improving their factory, they net a higher business rates bill. It should be based more on the land's value or land value with an adjustment for different property uses. That would encourage businesses to invest a lot more. Those would be my priorities.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sam. Thank you for all of those. Oh yeah, please clap. Those opening contributions. I think collectively you've set up a fantastic discussion. I've got a few questions of my own and then we'll come to the audience. My first question, possibly a bit of a two-parter and directed primarily at our elected panel members, but I'm interested in other perspectives as well. You often hear this view expressed that if Conservatives aren't for cutting taxes, what are they for? Now that seems to me a little bit of a narrow view. You can't exist solely as the tax-cutting party, but how crucial to your electoral appeal do you think it is to be able to say, we cut your taxes or we're going to cut your taxes? And I think connected to that, how do we feel about the Conservatives' record on tax now. And not to load this question in too negative a direction, but I think you could sort of, over the last 13 years, identify two signature tax changes which occurred. One was significantly increasing the personal allowance and then bringing the national insurance threshold up with it. The other one was bringing down the corporation tax rate so significantly. So we know the corporation tax rate has gone up a little bit, and probably less easily perceived, but nonetheless true, is that with this prolonged freeze on the tax thresholds, we're going to undermine a lot of that achievement of the first half of the Conservative government in terms of raising the threshold at which people pay tax. So the question really is, how important is the tax story to you as Conservatives seeking election, and how good a story do you feel like you have to tell?
I'm happy to have a go at that. Look, the key reason why you vote for a Conservative or a centre-right government is the philosophy, as Andrea articulately expressed, that we believe there are moral benefits from people keeping more of their own money. Individuals, families, businesses, we believe that is a moral value, and it's a value that we share. But what is upstream of that, because I'm going to have a go at trying to reframe this. Yeah. I suspect I will fail deeply. But the question is, can we cut taxes? It's not which tax we should cut. We've all got our own, lists. 100 people in the room, you'd all have 100 slightly different lists of which is the most egregious or distortive tax, or which is the biggest candidate to get us growing again, right? That's very, very respectable, fertile area of debate for Conservative Party conference. The real thing that we've got to do in terms of that broader agenda of spending your money wisely is tackle the delivery of public services, because that's the sustainable path to cutting whatever your desired flavour of tax in time is. And that's a really exciting agenda. If you think about the entire rise of digital, the fact we're all able to buy things on Amazon, we're storing things in the cloud, we've revolutionised the delivery of so many different services. If you get ill, a GP was telling me that 90% of the people that he sees in his clinic have either themselves or had a loving relative, research their symptoms online. If you're a small business, these days you're storing most of your information in the cloud. You can get yourself set up, virtually without a premises at all. So big parts of the domain in which we live have changed profoundly, and we haven't seen that same level of change in many of the services that are delivered by the state. So, I know this is a domain in which CPS spends a lot of time working in, but that is the seed. That's a really, really important question as to how is it over time that we can go back to being able to reduce taxes.
Absolutely, thank you.
Can I just,
go ahead.
One tiny shout out is that we did at the spring budget actually reduce the tax, and it's really important as a state of our values. Does anyone know what that was? We actually scrapped it. We didn't merely reduce it. So we scrapped the cap, the pensions lifetime allowance cap, above which was a very egregious rate of tax. It was a distortive rate of tax. And it's very important to me because although that didn't cost a vast amount of money, so it was able to be accommodated while still balancing the books, that was a real statement of values, because that, like other taxes some people have mentioned, spoke to the incentives in society to save for your retirement, to provide for yourself, and do a good Conservative philosophy. So don't lose heart. We do have to balance the books. Today is not the day. But even in the straitened circumstances we were in the spring budget, the Chancellor, the Prime Minister, did scrap a tax.
So in direct answer to your questions, Tom, the first one was, is there any point in the Conservative Party if not to cut taxes? And the answer to that is, the point of the Conservative Party is to create opportunity, is to help people to help themselves. Now that includes tax cutting, but it's by no means exclusively tax cutting. So it's about giving people opportunities to help themselves. So it's about levelling up, cutting taxes, giving you a good education, keeping you safe. It's all of those things. That is our values. And your second question was, what do I think about our record on taxes since 2010? And actually, I think overall it's been very good. And Andrew's rightly pointed to the two black swan events, the global pandemic and the war in Europe, creating a necessity to raise taxes. But when you look at the backdrop, the 3 million people no longer paying any taxes because they're not earning more than their personal tax-free allowance, and NI has been lifted to meet that same level, so 3 million people not paying tax at all. And the progressivity of tax, whereby the top 5% of earners pay 50% of all taxes, that is highly progressive. I think that is what people in the country would want to see, that those with the broadest shoulders bear the highest burden. People on the lowest incomes being lifted out of it altogether. But at the same time, we've got to have this overarching desire to let everybody keep more of what they earn. And actually, you know, when I was growing up, my parents had a furniture shop. And at the time, under a Labour government, they were paying 98% tax on super tax on the self-employed. So for the incremental pound of income, they got to keep 2 pence. And it's exactly like one of our very good colleagues in the House of Lords said the other day, you know, we tax cigarettes to stop people smoking. And if we tax work, they're going to stop working. So again, this lifting of the lifetime allowance on the consultants and doctors, absolutely the right thing to do. You want people to feel incentivized to keep working.
Let me come in with a different question here. So one of my colleagues in a former job used to talk about Mitchell's golden rule, and this was basically you'd be able to afford tax cuts so long as the private sector grew faster than the government. And that always seemed like kind of an easy thing. Private sector grows faster than the government. Over the years, though, that's become a lot more challenging. We all know about the growth problems we have in the economy, this sort of sense of stagnation, flatlining productivity, lackluster investment and everything. Similarly, we have real spending pressures, which are built up over years, but then will probably be dwarfed in future by the impact of an aging population and the need, on present policy at least, to spend a lot more on things like healthcare and pensions and so on for the over 65s. So I'm curious for the panel, and we'll start maybe with the think tankers on this. How do we improve those fundamentals, either from the perspective of getting growth up, or do we have to think about what the state does and how it can do it in a significantly different fashion?
So to take the latter question on first, I guess, we've had a relative reduction in the size of the state in terms of due to austerity, right? We've had a reduction in spending than otherwise would have been, but we've not had a fundamental discussion about the role of the state. And I think the public are probably relatively comfortable with most of the services provided by the state. They might be willing to add an extra regulatory burden on business here and there, and it really does add up and create problems. But fundamentally, I don't think we're going to move to a system where, healthcare is much more of an insurance system. I think that would be very, very unlikely to happen. So I think in general, we kind of have to focus on the former. How do we get growth up? Because we want to deliver those existing services that people are sort of comfortable with and expect to a high standard. And I think that has to start by looking at the main drag on growth, which is the housing supply problem. The fact that in large parts of the country, the cost of a new home is sometimes 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times the actual cost of building the home, because the planning permission has become so valuable, particularly in London, where we're just not building enough homes, including on brownfield land where projects would be viable if they got the planning permission. If you could allow more people to work in places where the prevailing wage is higher, they would end up paying more in tax, and that would mean that the public purse would be healthier, and you'd be able to cut taxes elsewhere for people across the country. But at the moment, because London, and it's not just London, it's also Cambridge, Oxford, are not building what they need to be building, the rest of the country has a higher tax burden, and that needs to change.
And within that, I think it's incumbent to look at some of the taxes that are sort of wrapped up within that. Stamp duty is obviously a massive thing. People not wanting to downsize because of the tax bill they'll be hit with, and that sort of stifles the economic mobility of people around the country to flood into those areas where they're going to be most productive. And I suppose that would be an example of where we could look at cutting taxes to genuinely get that growth. I think sometimes it is overplayed, this idea that we can just cut any tax and it will pay for itself. I don't think that's quite as true as some of us on this panel might like it to be, and probably in the audience as well. But there certainly are taxes that really are a real drag on growth, and stamp duty being an example of that. And I'd love to see some of the Conservative Party, which has done a lot on this tax since it came to power, but maybe we could go a little bit further, sort of absorb some of that short-term hit, but for that longer-term growth.
Okay. One more for the politicians, and then we'll come to the audience. When it comes to making the case for tax cuts, when it's possible, tell me a little bit about the challenges you face. Andrew, you already mentioned the lifetime allowance and getting rid of, for pension contributions, getting rid of that fantastic move. There was some backlash, and it was a predictable backlash, right? It was people saying, this is a tax cut for the rich. And one of the problems, I think, when we talk about tax cuts or even just tax reform, is that the politics and the economics can be in tension. What the economists say will boost growth, the politicians might say, but that's not going to win us any votes, and this might, in fact, stoke up a little bit of controversy. People will always say, that's for the rich, that's for business. How do we square this circle? You guys are the experts on this. How do you communicate your tax-cutting message?
Well, the facts are always a good start, right? I mean, there are people in the, we mentioned the Resolution Foundation. I mean, they've got a particular shtick. They come from a particular compass point on the political spectrum. You don't expect to engage in some of the most challenging policy debates that any of us are sent to Parliament to do, and not find some people who are party pre. But in the case of that, we looked at the facts. People knew that their GP was retiring early. They saw their hospital consultant only working 2 or 3 days a week. They know that a relative of theirs is spending more time on the golf course because of the disincentive to work. That is not a great term, but that was people's lived experience. I think when it comes to public service reform, folk know that. Right, the people who work in the NHS, they'll all sidle up to you and say, look, it really isn't working. There's a debate there that we can step into. I thought, the approach taken by the Prime Minister in this conference of making long-term choices, almost by definition, hard choices. People send us to Westminster to make hard choices. If they weren't hard, they'd have been made already by somebody else, somewhere else in the ether. Parliament is about that crucible for having precisely these debates. So I think as long as we are not anchored, even as somebody who's a massive CPS fan, as long as we're not anchored in ideology, as long as we're not coming up with theoretical approaches, but the things that we either diagnose for society in terms of the reforms that we need to be made. I mean, we look at housing and planning, right? One of the biggest real-world constraints is just there aren't enough people doing enough work in planning departments. You can debate whether they're there or whether they've got the resources, but I've yet to see the local council chief exec that's cutting their own pension in order to fund the prioritisation of planning to get young people on the housing ladder. These are trade-offs, and we should trust our conservative instincts, but as long as those are rooted in the experience and in pursuit of building the better society that we wish to see.
I mean, just to take a slightly different tack, I think we can all have our own, exactly as someone said, we've all got our own choices on what taxes we would cut, but I think there is a very specific positive that would be accepted by everyone, and that is for flatter, simpler taxes. You know, we had an Office for Tax Simplification, which David Cameron established and has now just been abolished. And it's ridiculous. You know, on the Treasury Select Committee, we tried very hard to persuade the government not to abolish it. Why? Because tax has got more complicated, not less, since the Office for Tax Simplification was established. And now somehow the Treasury is going to report every year on how it has simplified taxes. Not going to happen. And so the reality is that what you end up with is, if you are an entrepreneur, small business, if you're an electrician or a hairdresser or you've got a pub, you're having to do ever more complicated tax computations because there's this here and that there, and you've got this little allowance here. We've got something like 187 different tax allowances, some of which haven't been used in years. So I think flatter and simpler taxes, and also then equating some of them so that you have your national insurance. For example, I would get rid of national insurance. The whole idea of that was that it was bifurcated to pay for the for the health service. That just goes into general taxation. Simpler taxes, I think, would make life a lot easier for everybody.
Sam?
I was just going to say, one way you can sell some of these important tax cuts that are pro-growth yet seemingly benefit the well-off is by focusing on principle. And one principle that I'm a big fan of is the principle in your report on making work pay, Tom. It's a very good report because it makes the principle that no one should really be shelling out half of their marginal pound that they earn to the tax system. And if you set that as the limit, because obviously the very, very highest earners pay 45p if they're honest and haven't got any strategic tax planning or any of that sort of thing going on. So why should people in the sort of middle or upper income brackets pay less than them? If you define it as a principled approach to taxation, and you at the same time look at the cliff edges that you get in the benefit system and address some of those by looking at the taper rate, which the government have done good work on, that is one way of making the case for reforms that not only boost growth but actually are seen as fair to the public.
All right, let's go to the audience then. Yep, I'm going to group the questions together from the start. We've probably got about 15 minutes for questions, so please do keep them short. Mark, if you want to start with the gentleman next to you there, and then we'll move along the row to the lady at the other end.
Good afternoon. Is it not the case that we focus too much on cutting taxes for older people, such as the lifetime pension allowance, and not enough focus on cutting taxes to benefit younger people, such as the stamp duty, land tax? Because if we're not careful, what we'll do is develop a generation that doesn't own capital, so there'll be no need for inheritance tax, because there'll be no inheritance to leave.
And just along the road there, please.
Hi there, it's Katie Watts from moneysavingexpert.com. So I think there's a massive gap in the understanding and misunderstanding around tax. You spoke about pensions lifetime allowance, about inheritance tax, who that actually affects and by how much. For example, inheritance tax, quite high estate value for an average consumer. So I just wondered, within policy, how do you propose to end that gap in understanding for people of where their tax is? So it's about understanding, not just simplification of the system.
Great, and there one more on this side. Did I have a hand here? Yep, right there.
Hi, it's Joe Mays from Bloomberg. I'm interested in Andrew and Andrea's thoughts on this one particularly. So the Treasury argument is that tax cuts are inflationary, but do you think that's true of tax cuts for businesses? Because at the spring budget, the Chancellor announced a big tax break for businesses through full expensing, with the idea of increasing investment, increasing productivity, increasing the supply side of the economy, which you would have thought would have a downward effect on prices because there are more goods in the economy. So I want to hear, is it true for business tax cuts that they're inflationary?
Brilliant. So our three questions there: are tax cuts inflationary? Are business tax cuts in particular inflationary? Do we have an understanding gap when it comes to taxes and who they affect and to what extent? And then this thorny intergenerational question, which we are going to come to in the next panel as well. But are we at risk of prioritising lower taxes and indeed higher benefits for the old, while the young are facing very high tax bills? Andrew, why don't we come to you first and we'll work along the panel. And pick whichever bits of those questions you'd like to respond to.
Yeah, well, starting with Joe, I mean, the impact depends is the simple answer. It's not a wholly satisfactory answer, but it depends entirely on what you're doing. If it's bringing forward an investment, if it's a good or commodity that's in relative abundance and you can just deploy that, then it's not inflationary. If you rush out and buy something that at that particular moment everyone's trying to buy the same good and there's limited supply, it will be inflationary. So a bit dissatisfactory, Joe, but the answer is clearly it depends on what the category that you're trying to procure is. I mean, the one I don't have an answer to, but the one I feel very empathetic to is this point about the generational differences between, those generations that have, either already accumulated wealth versus the young. That's a big topic because it's not just about, tax policy. It's a lot about other areas of my domain in terms of the rules around access to capital, the parameters that the financial regulators set on whether you can and can't get a mortgage, who can access credit. I don't think we have long enough today, Tom, on that, but that's fine. And just Katie, the money saving expert does a great job, but I think people do understand. I think even if they don't understand the minutiae, I think people do, people have strong views about particular taxes, and I think they do have an understanding of the main elements of tax and what they think is fair.
Andrea?
I'm not sure I can give an entirely different perspective from Andrew on this. I mean, obviously, tax cuts, are they inflationary or not, does depend. Tax cuts now, personal tax would increase demand. That would be relatively simple to understand, and abolishing VAT would be inflationary, of course it would, but actually reducing business incentives or increasing business incentives to invest in, for example, net zero, in sort of reducing their carbon footprint and so on, that may have no impact or indeed be positive for prices. So it really does depend. It's very hard to, it depends on which tax. So per se, tax cuts aren't inflationary of and by themselves. In terms of understanding of tax, I actually do agree with you that there is a problem, particularly for young people, and actually it goes to the heart of the things that we would like young people to learn more about. I do think there's a very strong case for young people at the same time as learning the square root of 3, might also need to learn something about how to take out a mortgage, how to take out some debt, what to do if you get yourself into debt problems, etc. People like Money Saving Expert and Citizens Advice Bureau do some great work there. And it is very, very important to understand your own taxes. As we all know, ignorance is no defence as far as HMRC are concerned. And as a constituency MP, I get lots of people writing to me saying, I'm owed a £5 grand tax rebate and they won't give me the money, but when I owed the money last year, they came for me straight away. So I think there is an issue there, and there is more to be done. I'd love to see more being done in schools with financial education. And then do we cut taxes for old people more than young? I suppose in a way what we do is we try and support those who are on those fixed incomes without the ongoing ability to increase their own income by working more hours or changing their job or whatever. So we're trying to preserve their income. But at the same time, I would just like to say again, scrapping inheritance tax won't help them because they'll be dead. I just want to be clear about this. And so that actually does, in fact, act as an intergenerational transfer, which I think has a lot going for it. And in fact, my parliamentary assistant is very keen on that idea because he thinks his grandparents will leave it all to him. And that would be great for him.
Eamon.
I'm just trying to think which one to put. I mean, maybe on the question about simplicity, I think is interesting, and particularly on sort of the younger thing. I mean, we talk to entrepreneurs. We do a lot about sort of entrepreneurship education, sort of among kind of younger people who might want to go into entrepreneurship. And I think there is kind of a feeling that maybe because of the complexity, there's a bit of there's anxieties about that, and maybe that does put people off going into entrepreneurship, taking that first step. There probably is such a thing as too much simplicity as well. I think having some sort of granularity within the tax system is good, and we wouldn't necessarily want just kind of a few blanket taxes to prop up the whole state. But no, I think there is a lot in that, and if that's discouraging kind of more people going into the business, then I guess that would be a bad thing.
So when we talk about understanding taxation, there's a part that's so far in the debate been missed, which is that who pays a tax legally, who hands the cash over, isn't always the person who feels the burden. So, you know, Coca-Cola pays the soft drinks industry levy, but it's the consumer of Coca-Cola who ends up feeling the actual impact in their pocket. And that becomes more complicated when you look in taxes like business taxes. So something like bringing in more generous capital allowances, that's seen as a tax cut for business. But of course, as Mitt Romney once said, corporations are people, my friend. This is the point he was making, by the way. He wasn't defending corporate personhood or anything like that. And in that point, essentially, what happens when a company has disincentive to invest? They don't buy that new equipment. And because they didn't buy that new equipment, the worker who works there is less productive. And because they're less productive, their wage is lower. And so something that is seen as a tax cut for business or seen as something very out of tune with you know, what the people need at this exact time ends up actually being a way of raising wages for people on ordinary incomes. And you know, inheritance tax is a good example, right? The thing that drives me mad about inheritance tax is not the fundamental unfairness or that kind of debate. You know, I'm not particularly worried about taxing inheritances per se. What worries me is the system of inheritance tax leads people to do lots of stupid things. The reason Jeremy Clarkson is a farmer now, originally, was because he knew that buying farmland meant you could avoid inheritance tax.
Yeah.
And so it's worked out because he's still making TV programs, but some people buy farms and become less productive because they could be doing other things, because they want to put their income in different resources, and it distorts markets. Lots of people buy shares in the alternative investment market, not because they think that's the best investment, not because they think, oh, that's better than the SEIS investment or the EIS investment, or, you know, I should just put in a tracker safely, but because they know that that has inheritance tax benefits. And all of that distortion adds up, and that means that we are poorer as a result, because we're distorting what is fundamentally meant to be, you know, quite sensible investment decisions. So, you know, if we can target some of those distortions first and then use that to lower the rate, I think that would be a very good approach.
All right. Let's have a cluster of questions on this side of the room now, please. So, Mark, there's a chap right at the back, and then we'll take these two at the front afterwards, please.
Hi, John Hollis, Twickenham Conservatives. Would the panel agree that a key part of enabling tax cuts is to cut or freeze spending? And given the limits of just salami slicing budgets, that means persuading the public that the government should stop spending money on some of the things which it currently spends money on. So if so, how might we best do that?
Excellent, thank you. All the way down to the front two rows, please, Mark.
Thank you very much. My name is Jonathan Smith. I'm from Kettering, just north of Manchester's constituency. And my question relates to something Angela said, which was that she felt that the way that child benefit works with regards to the £50,000 cliff edge should be reformed. My question to the panel is, why not go further and just introduce joint taxation for married couples? Surely two people earning £40,000 a year should pay the same tax as one person earning £80,000.
Excellent, thank you. And front row.
Michael Dango, Axelot Foundation. I get it that you can't reduce taxes when there's inflation, but back a few years ago, the Bank of England were trying to use quantitative easing to bring up inflation. Why was it not taken the opportunity at that time to reduce taxation to bring up inflation? As rather than the Bank of England going and buying bonds and losing money on it eventually. And just one quick point about taxation. There's one tax that should be lowered as soon as possible. The tax that the Conservative Party brought in, the 60% tax rate, should be brought down as soon as possible.
Thank you very much.
At £100,000 you pay 60% marginal rate. That should go.
Absolutely. It's almost like I planted those questions. They're all very much in my wheelhouse, but I'm not the one in the hot seat here. If we're going to cut taxes, really, does the government have to stop doing things? is efficiency ever going to be enough? Should we move beyond just getting rid of the high income child benefit charge and introduce some form of family taxation as well? Maybe that should be a kind of manifesto commitment or aspiration, even if it's not something we could do right away. And then the final questions there about QE and inflation. It does feel a little bit like the government has it both ways on this argument about taxes and inflation. And should we be getting rid of that withdrawal of the personal allowance at 100,000 if and when we have the chance? Let's go the other way along the panel this time. Okay, you go first. You go first.
Otherwise, I'll shoot off. John, exactly right. I mean, that's the whole thing that I've been saying is the path to cutting taxes is to first identify how we cut spending. And in truth, any good finance director knows you can drive out a few percentage points of productivity improvement every year. The fact that the public sector, has had relatively little reform means there should be more low-hanging fruit to go after. But ultimately, you've got to make those decisions about stopping doing things. If you really want to reframe that, you've got to stop doing things. I'll leave the family taxation and child benefit to my brilliant colleague. The reality as to why we would not have been able to cut taxes in 2008 was the state of the public finances that Labour left us. And we are at a Conservative conference, we are talking about cutting taxes. The path to cutting taxes is self-evidently to re-elect a Conservative government. And so I hope that's one thing we can definitely all agree on, that ultimately you've heard very strong moral cases for that. What we've actually got to do over the next 12 months, those of us that are elected, or those of you that want to see us elected, is actually help to get a Conservative government returned.
Right. And Andrew, you have to rush. Let's have a round of applause for Andrew Griffith, please. Sorry, guys. I joked we'd all talk about him once he was gone, but don't worry, he did so well. We won't say anything unpleasant. Let's have Sam, Eamon, and then Andrew will give the final word to you on this panel. But Sam.
I'll try and address the inflation. Essentially,
Sam, I think they can't hear you at the back.
Oh.
If your mic is a little. There you go. Just.
All right. Can you hear me now? Okay. Good. So on the inflation point, I think what's key is that we shouldn't try to manage inflation or the business cycle through fiscal policy, because the government moves quite slowly, and sometimes it's very easy to cut taxes to stimulate inflation and stimulate demand and keep employment at a decent level. It's much harder to do the other stuff, which is hike taxes and cut spending when you're in a crisis. The Bank of England, because it's independent and controls interest rates, is much more able to keep control of inflation than a government would be. It's hard to imagine a politician doing a similar level of retrenchment or austerity as the Bank of England have done over the past year or so. Obviously, they've been much more expansionary in the previous years, but the fact that they can go in those directions shows you why it's more useful for them to be doing it. If it was a chancellor, any chancellor who wanted to do such a big shift in policy would be booted out of office, and they would be known as sort of cruel and harsh. But the Bank of England can sort of suck that up a bit, and I think that's kind of what you want from managing inflation. Plus, the other problem is businesses want to be able to plan around the tax system. There are ways of hedging against inflation and hedging against interest rate rises. It's much harder if you think, oh, we're going to raise taxes this year or we're going to cut them this year, because usually the taxes we cut are different to the taxes we rise, and over time that will lead to lots of problems.
Eamon.
Great. I think I'll tackle the question at the back on sort of if we just hold tax constant, can that result in sort of lower spending? I would really like to believe that's true, but I'm not suggesting that's kind of what you're saying. Maybe I'm kind of misunderstanding the question, but yeah, I'm just not sure of that. And I'm really not sure of the politics of kind of going for another round of austerity. I'm no kind of election guru, but I just can't see that happening. And I guess kind of the counter to that, or the other side of that would be, therefore, it just makes it so much more incumbent on us to look at what we can do to go for growth, as the CPS have been campaigning on for the last couple of years or so. That, I think, is the more viable way out of this.
Andrea?
Okay, well, to answer all three questions, the first one, a key part of tax cuts is to stop spending. That's absolutely right. And there are areas that we can stop spending. Of course, as the sort of the COVID pandemic and the impact of the energy hike prices recedes into the distance, then those government extra expenditures will roll off. The Chancellor's already set out some determination to reduce the numbers in the civil service. I think there's massive potential for extra productivity in the civil service just by getting more people to work from the office rather than work from home, discuss. I think that is true of the entire economy, actually. Working from home is absolutely great so long as you're working. And I'm not casting aspersions at anyone, but I do think that the country does need to recognise the need to be more productive. Artificial intelligence, digital technology will help with that. Just to give one very good example, we will very soon have an electronic patient record for everybody in England through the NHS. That's going to massively improve productivity and capability within the NHS. That should reduce costs, but will it? So this is the thing, this is what government has to drive, is efficiency through better productivity, and that absolutely does then enable you to reduce taxes. In terms of the child benefit reform, there is a problem, and I'm slightly ambivalent on this, whether you should be able to opt to have joint taxation. I would be entirely in favour of. But of course, the reason why we don't have joint taxation is because of the issue of the power dynamic and the fact that people would be forced down certain routes by a partner. And so there is a very real concern over that. But actually, I do think, as David Cameron did in a very small way, enabling a transferable tax allowance from a non-working spouse to a working spouse, you could actually opt, should you wish to be jointly measured for tax purposes, as happens in a lot of European countries. That would again put more power into the hands of families. But I think we'd have to be careful there that both partners were willing and keen to do that. Then with the Bank of England, I think this is quite interesting. I actually don't agree with Sam here. I think there are questions to be asked. I mean, we've all assumed that Monetary Policy Committee establishment was the perfect solution, take it out of the hands of politicians. Actually, very often politicians are much more fleet of foot than the Monetary Policy Committee has been, and it's quite interesting. On the Treasury Committee, we've been challenging the Governor of the Bank of England to justify 17 interest rate hikes in a row, when quite clearly the pips are squeaking and people are struggling with the cost of living, and it is putting up not so much mortgages because of the sensible changes we made following the financial crisis, but certainly in terms of people who are indebted, who are really struggling with that, and businesses likewise. And actually, the Bank of England justifies it because their remit is 2% inflation. So if they push you into a recession, or if you lose your house, that's your tough luck. So in many ways, actually, politicians are better placed. Now, I'm not saying I would scrap the MPC, far from that, but what I do think is we should never get stuck on one route only. This is the only way, because it's worked in the past. Doesn't mean it shouldn't be challenged and we shouldn't reconsider. And certainly now, sort of 20 years on, is about the right time to be reconsidering, I would say.
Well, on that delightfully provocative note, we can draw this one to a close. Please join me in thanking our panel again.